The golf cart made a perfect arc through the air before flipping once and crashing into the lake with a thunderous splash that sent ducks fleeing and silence rippling across the morning mist. It was 6:12 a.m. The only sound afterward was the shrill scream of Karenette McDougal, president of the Lakeside Harmony HOA, as she flailed in the water, clutching a soggy clipboard and trying to dog paddle with one high-heeled shoe still on. I stood there on my porch, coffee in hand, stunned but not surprised. I had warned her the ramp was slippery in the early morning. But of course, in typical HOA fashion, she hadn't listened. She had driven her little pastel green cart straight onto my boat ramp, trying to hammer in one of her infamous unauthorized signs. HOA property NO boat access. The irony? She'd just trespassed onto my land to accuse me of breaking rules that never applied to me in the first place. I didn't laugh. Not yet. But I did start recording. They say retirement should be peaceful. That's why I bought this place. A quiet, unincorporated lakefront parcel with its own old concrete ramp built in the 70s. It was rough around the edges, but so was I. After 30 years of working in construction law and dealing with city inspectors, zoning boards, and municipal madness, I thought I'd found the one place where no one could tell me how high my grass should be or what color I could paint my mailbox. I was wrong. Because a year after I moved in, the newly formed HOA for the Lakeside Harmony community moved in like termites with clipboards, bylaws, and a serious thirst for power. And nothing attracted Karen McDougal's attention more than the idea that someone had something she couldn't control. To understand the absurdity of all this, you have to realize that my house isn't even technically part of the HOA. The previous owners of my lot opted out when the surrounding development was built, but the HOA has always treated me like a rogue state at their border. First, they complained that my boat made too much noise when I launched at sunrise. Then it was that my dock didn't match the aesthetic of the community. They even left a citation once for my dog barking, though I don't own a dog. But the real war began when I decided to repave the old boat ramp. It was cracked and mossy, and I figured a little elbow grease would make it safer. Little did I know that smoothing concrete on your own property was now apparently a declaration of civil rebellion. Karen started small, as they always do. First, she sent me a letter, stamped with the HOA logo even though it wasn't official, to inform me that my renovations were not in accordance with Lakeside Design Cohesion standards. When I ignored that, she began issuing fake violations taped to my mailbox. I collected them in a binder. Then came the neighborhood emails. She called my ramp an environmental hazard. She claimed it disrupted the natural shoreline. She even accused me of disturbing nesting herons, despite the fact I had video of her grandkids chasing them with pool noodles last summer. When the smear campaign didn't work, she decided to escalate. Last week, she called in a county inspector. I was more than happy to walk him through the permits, original plats, and even a dusty old deed that showed my land and its ramp were not only legal but grandfathered in long before the HOA existed. The inspector nodded, jotted down a few notes, and told me I was well within my rights. Karen, who had followed us around like a hawk, fumed silently and then stormed off yelling that no ramp should be allowed without community approval. I chuckled. The community didn't build this ramp. And they sure didn't pay for the concrete I hauled in last summer under 100-degree sun. But none of that prepared me for this morning's performance. I'd heard the sound of the cart tires crunching on gravel and thought it was one of the neighborhood kids. When I looked out and saw Karen herself holding a hammer and trying to wedge a wooden stake into my property, I figured I'd give her 30 seconds before asking her to leave. She gave me 10 before she revved the cart forward to reposition and drove right onto the ramp. Wet from dew and as slick as ice, the ramp didn't forgive. Her cart spun sideways, skidded, and then slowly tipped over into the lake like some sort of HOA Titanic. For a second it just bobbed, her clipboard floating nearby, then it sank with a gurgle as she flailed, gasping, furious, blaming me for everything. By the time emergency services arrived, summoned by a neighbor who heard her screams, Karen was wrapped in a silver foil blanket, sputtering about legal action. She kept shouting that I lured her onto the ramp, that it was an ambush, and that my non-compliant surface was a public danger. The paramedics ignored her. The sheriff deputy took my statement and, after I showed him the footage from my door camera, quietly shook his head and said, "Some people just can't handle dry land." I nodded, biting back laughter. What Karen didn't realize, what the entire HOA hadn't realized, was that I'd had enough. Enough of their fake violations, their bullying, their endless attempts to control a patch of land they didn't own. What began as a petty vendetta over a ramp was about to turn into something much bigger. Because what they didn't know was that my property didn't just include the ramp. It included the original shoreline path the HOA now used to access the lake. A thin strip of land they'd always assumed was community property, but had never actually claimed in writing. And now, with Karen's little stunt on record and a new legal fire lit under me, I had the perfect reason to do what I should have done months ago: close that access. Not out of revenge. Out of principle. I wasn't going to let a bunch of bored suburban tyrants dictate how I lived on land I paid for, maintained, and respected. They wanted a battle over boat ramps? Fine. I was about to show them what a real war looked like. No more warnings. No more ignoring them, hoping they'd go away. They had picked the wrong man, and now, thanks to Karen's early morning dive, I had everything I needed to make my move. The HOA had tried to ban my boat ramp. Now I was going to revoke their entire access to the lake. Permanently. 2 days after Karen's impromptu splashdown, I was raking some leaves near the edge of my lot when I heard the unmistakable buzz of her voice cutting through the morning air like a malfunctioning mosquito. I peeked through the trees and saw her striding across my property again, this time with reinforcements, a clipboard-wielding man in khakis and a safety vest, and a third person who appeared to be recording with their phone. Karen walked like she owned the ground beneath her feet, marching up to my dock with the same entitlement as if she were storming a castle. The man with her looked nervous. He turned toward my house, then back to the ramp, and asked in a low voice if this was indeed HOA property. Karen waved him off with a dismissive gesture and told him that the paperwork was just a formality. I decided to wait. Let them get comfortable. Let them hang themselves with their own rope. I had already installed a few trail cameras the day after the lake cart incident, just in case someone got any creative ideas. One caught her walking across the lot earlier that morning while muttering into a Bluetooth headset, rehearsing lines about environmental impact and community safety. Another camera closer to the dock caught every step of her uninvited inspection. She had a tape measure in hand and was pointing out distances to the man in khakis, who clearly didn't want to be there. Then, unbelievably, she began pulling at one of the wooden support posts I had installed near the dock. That was the final straw. I stepped out from the trees and called down to her calmly, asking if she needed help with the math. Her face turned beet red the moment she realized she was being watched, and the man next to her nearly dropped his clipboard. Karen immediately shifted into legal threat mode, flinging phrases like public interest, community jurisdiction, and non-compliant modification. I responded with 3 simpler words: private property trespassing. The man in the safety vest finally introduced himself as a city environmental liaison. Apparently, Karen had filed a complaint that my ramp was causing soil erosion into the lake. I asked him flatly if he had a copy of that complaint, and when he pulled out a packet, I took a good long look. The top page had a familiar HOA header, but no supporting documents, no photos, no signature from an actual inspector. It was just Karen's word. I smiled and invited them to follow me to the porch. I wanted to show them something. Inside, I opened the original land documents, the official plats that dated back to the 1970s. The ramp, dock, shoreline, and a narrow stretch of pathway from the main road to the water all fell under my parcel. Not 1 inch of it belonged to the HOA. More importantly, the HOA's entire lake access point, The part they used for their weekend kayak sessions and summer float parties, rested entirely on that narrow sliver of land that connected through my property. For decades it had been used peacefully, and the original owners allowed it informally. But no one ever formalized an easement. There was no legal record. I could see the wheels turning in the city worker's head. He knew what this meant. Karen didn't. She was too busy scanning my documents like she was looking for a spelling mistake to invalidate everything. When she started raising her voice again, I calmly pulled out my phone and played back footage from the trail cam. It showed her touching and tugging on my dock supports. The city worker immediately told her that was out of bounds and reminded her she had no authority to inspect or modify anything. Karen stammered, turning to him like he was supposed to back her up. He stepped away and mumbled something about needing to file a report. She tried to save face by declaring that the HOA will be elevating this to the county level. I just nodded and told her I hoped they brought snacks, because they'd be there for a while. Later that day, I made a call to my old law school friend, Mark. Mark was a real estate judge who owed me more than a few favors from our younger years, back when I helped him fight off a bogus land seizure case. I emailed him the plats, the footage, and the HOA's fake complaint letter. He responded within an hour. The land was unquestionably mine. The HOA had no claim, and more importantly, the lake access the neighborhood had been using without official permission could legally be blocked at my discretion. He added, almost as an afterthought, that if the HOA wanted to push back, it would be them facing legal trouble for harassment and repeated trespassing. The power dynamic had shifted, and they didn't even know it yet. Over the next 24 hours, I did some quiet investigating of my own. I visited the county registrar's office and pulled every document the HOA had submitted in the last 2 years. Not a single one referenced my property or a right-of-way to the lake. I checked the HOA's website and found maps that conveniently excluded my land from any official community zone. That meant they knew. They knew they didn't have legal access. They were bluffing. Their entire sense of control was a lie wrapped in formal fonts and plastic nameplate. That night, I walked the lake path under the moonlight, staring at the part where the neighborhood trail meandered through a patch of pine trees and subtly shifted from HOA-maintained gravel to the rougher soil of my land. I placed surveyor flags at the legal boundary, just to mark it, and I smiled, because in a strange way, this wasn't just about the ramp anymore. It was about the arrogance of people who think a laminated badge makes them kings and queens of everything in their line of sight. The next morning, Karen was back. This time standing at the edge of the flagged line, arms crossed, camera out, and her husband behind her like a poorly dressed bodyguard. She didn't cross the boundary, but she made sure I knew she was there. She took photos of the flags, of my ramp, even of my mailbox. I waved. She didn't wave back. Instead, she yelled out that I was creating tension in the community. I walked down and said, "No, Karen, I'm just protecting what's mine." She didn't reply, just turned and stomped away. Back inside, I sat down at my desk and opened a new file. I titled it Operation Lockdown Lake, because the time for warnings was over. I wasn't going to just defend my property anymore. I was going to make sure they felt every inch of consequence for the way they'd treated me. And the first step? Filing an official notice with the HOA and the county that effective immediately, lake access via my land was revoked. Let's see how they host their paddleboard yoga sessions now. The following Monday morning was the calm before the storm, and I used that stillness to install the first physical reminder that things had changed. The gate was a custom-made iron arch, heavy enough to stop a truck and elegant enough to make a statement. It stretched across the access path with reinforced steel posts and a coated lockbox. On either side, I mounted waterproof laminated signs that read in bold lettering, "Private property NO lake access trespassers will be prosecuted." Just beneath it, I fixed a second sign with a QR code that linked directly to the county's plat records, complete with highlighted boundary lines and the recorded parcel history. Everything was legal, everything was documented, and everything was impossible to ignore. I wasn't leaving room for debate. The days of looking the other way while they strutted through my land like they owned it were over. Not even 2 hours after the gate went up, I received the first phone call. The number was unfamiliar but local. I picked up. A woman's voice, clipped and formal, introduced herself as the HOA's new compliance director. She informed me that a barricade had been reported and asked if I was aware it was blocking a community heritage trail. I almost laughed. Instead, I asked her to clarify the definition of community heritage and whether that phrase showed up anywhere in the county's legal zoning code. She stuttered and said she'd have to check. I told her she could take all the time she needed and that any future calls should be directed to my attorney. I hung up and poured myself a celebratory glass of iced tea. By noon, a small group had assembled by the gate, 3 residents, all of whom I recognized from past HOA meetings. One of them, a retired dentist named Larry, had once tried to fine me for inappropriate dock footwear because I walked barefoot across my own deck. He pointed at the sign and shouted from behind the barrier, asking if this was some sort of joke. I told him it wasn't, but if he wanted something funny, I could bring out a copy of the original land deed from 1973 and watch him try to understand it. That didn't go over well. He muttered something about legal action and stormed off. I knew that wouldn't be the last I'd hear of him, or of the HOA. Later that afternoon, I checked my trail cams and saw footage of 2 more HOA members approaching the gate, reading the sign, and then tugging on the lock like teenagers trying to sneak into a concert. One of them kicked the post in frustration. Another tried to film himself ranting about public safety hazards, but the video ended abruptly when a wasp from a nearby nest landed on his shoulder and he screamed like a kettle. I archived the footage. It might come in handy later. That night, I received a warning email from the HOA board. They claimed that my fence violated the Communal Scenic Integrity Clause of the Neighborhood Code. I nearly spit out my coffee. Scenic integrity. That was their argument now. I replied with a single sentence and a PDF attachment. Please see enclosed documentation showing your board has no jurisdiction over my land. I included 10 pages of legal exhibits, county records, and zoning map. No response followed. 2 days later, the HOA announced they'd be holding a Lake Freedom Day event, a community-wide lake celebration with water balloons, paddleboard yoga, and a spontaneous float. The flyer made no mention of how they intended to get to the lake, since their only entry point had been sealed off. Still, I wasn't surprised when I heard the sounds of rubber saws and dragging coolers echoing down my property that Saturday morning. I watched from the shade of my porch, sipping black coffee, as over 30 people marched straight toward my gate, hauling inner tubes, folding chairs, and kids covered in sunscreen. They stared at the locked gate in confusion and disbelief. Karen, ever the general, showed up last. She wore a wide sun hat and a t-shirt that read HOA Strong. She pointed at the sign, scoffed, and waved her phone around like it was a magic wand that could undo real estate law. She turned to the crowd and announced they would be entering anyway, that this was their right as a collective community. Then she led them around the fence, toward a side trail that had been closed off for years but still touched a thin line of my property. I had anticipated that move. As soon as they crossed the boundary, I stepped onto the trail with a sheriff's deputy behind me. The deputy, a soft-spoken guy named Jim who I'd known since I moved here, had a folder full of cease and desist orders and trespassing notices already printed. I had filed the paperwork the day before, just in time for this stunt. Jim addressed the crowd politely, informing them that they were on private land, that no easement existed, and that the landowner, me, had revoked access officially and legally. He held up the forms like a teacher presenting test result. Some of the crowd began to grumble. A few kids started crying. Karen tried to argue that she had verbal approval from a previous owner, which of course meant nothing legally. When Jim handed her a notice and asked her to sign acknowledging she'd been warned, she grabbed it and crumpled it theatrically. Then, as if to prove her authority, she ordered everyone to push through anyway. Nobody moved. A few residents turned and walked away, embarrassed. Others began to whisper about whether this would affect their property values. I stood back and let it all unfold. I didn't need to say anything. The HOA had done a fine job digging their own hole. After the failed party, Karen launched her next desperate move. She filed a formal complaint with the county environmental office, claiming my new gate was obstructing natural drainage and endangering fish habitats. It was so absurd I initially thought it was satire. But when an inspector actually showed up, I gave him a tour of the area and showed him the gravel runoff design I had installed to ensure erosion control. He walked the property, nodded in approval, and said my work was better than half the county's own park. He filed his report that same evening. Complaint dismissed. Meanwhile, the HOA newsletter was spinning the narrative fast. They accused me of hoarding water access and intentionally sabotaging community spirit. But what they didn't print was the growing number of residents who had started emailing me directly, apologizing for the board's behavior and asking if I'd ever consider granting limited access again. I told them I'd think about it. Privately, I had no intention of relenting. Not yet. Then came the graffiti. One morning I walked out to find someone had spray-painted a message across the outer wall of the gate in red. You can't own nature. It wasn't exactly Banksy-level clever, but it told me one thing clearly. They were desperate now. And desperation makes people sloppy. I installed 2 new cameras, higher resolution and motion-triggered with night vision. Then I power-washed the message off the gate, not out of anger, but because I didn't want anything ruining the aesthetic of their defeat. The battle had started with a ramp, but now it was about more than concrete or kayak. This was about standing up to people who thought rules didn't apply to them. About showing them that not every inch of the world could be reshaped by committee votes and badly written bylaws. I wasn't just defending land anymore. I was holding a mirror up to every inch of their arrogance. And they didn't like what they saw. The morning after the graffiti incident, I found myself at the county clerk's office filing a deed adjustment so narrow and specific it made the clerk raise an eyebrow. I wasn't just protecting my land anymore, I was weaponizing it. I divided a slender 10-foot wide, 100-foot long slice of my property right along the path the HOA used for lake access. Then, in the most poetic twist of this entire ordeal, I sold that strip for $1 to a local jet ski rental company named Ripwave Watersports, a business Karen had personally tried to sue 2 years ago for causing noise and violating the lake's serenity. Their owner, Doug, remembered her well. He couldn't stop laughing when I made the offer, and he even insisted on signing the deal at her favorite coffee shop for the drama of it. That strip now belonged to someone with zero patience for HOA games and every legal right to run their rental business through it. 2 days later, Doug installed a colorful wooden kiosk right on the edge of the HOA's usual path, complete with a buzzing card reader, a sign-up booth, and speakers that looped reggae music from 9 a.m. to sunset. Suddenly, the HOA's former access trail looked more like the entrance to a beach festival. Doug put up a giant banner with bright red letters. Lake tours available daily, by appointment only. I sat back and watched it unfold from my porch, shaking my head in disbelief at how poetic it had all become. Karen must have felt like she was in a nightmare. Of course, she didn't stay silent for long. She sent out a neighborhood-wide email accusing me of colluding with disruptive businesses and monetizing land in violation of residential peace expectations. That phrase alone made me snort coffee out my nose. Monetizing land. As if I owed her or the HOA some spiritual debt to keep my land passive and silent for their benefit. She threatened legal action against Doug too, but he posted the entire email on his business's Facebook page with a caption that read, "Local HOA president thinks she owns the wind." The post went viral within the county, drawing attention from locals who had long been irritated by the HOA's antics. People who had never stepped foot near our lake suddenly wanted jet ski tours, and Doug was more than happy to oblige. Karen tried to rally the board, but her grip was loosening fast. The vice president, a timid man named Carl who always looked like he was 5 seconds away from fainting, privately reached out to me to apologize. He said he hadn't signed off on half of Karen's complaints and that several board members were threatening to resign if she didn't stop pushing personal vendettas. I told him I appreciated the honesty but wasn't interested in half measures. Either the HOA apologized publicly and acknowledged their overreach, or I would keep pressing the advantages. Carl sighed and said he'd try. I didn't hold my breath. Later that week, the HOA held an emergency meeting in the community clubhouse. I wasn't invited, obviously, but my neighbor Tom, a retired firefighter and the most level-headed man in the area, gave me the full breakdown. Apparently, the meeting turned into an all-out war. Karen demanded new legal action to reclaim the path. Others pointed out that it was no longer HOA-adjacent land, and that continuing to antagonize me would only invite more lawsuit. When she tried to shame anyone who disagreed with her, one of the members called her a dictator in pastel. Another said they'd rather paddle across the street in a kiddie pool than deal with her anymore. The final straw? Someone brought up the drone footage I had anonymously shared in the group chat showing HOA members illegally trespassing during the failed float party. That footage had Karen front and center, issuing commands like she was staging a coup. Board members began resigning one by one. By the end of the meeting, Karen was standing alone at the podium, shouting that the neighborhood was turning against her because of one petty landowner with a cement obsession. The next day, a formal petition began circulating to remove Karen from her role. To no one's surprise, it gained over 60% of signatures in the first 48 hours. I received 3 hand-delivered letters from neighbors asking if I would consider reopening access if she stepped down. I didn't give a straight answer. Not because I wanted to torment them, but because I wasn't finished. Karen had spent months making my life miserable, weaponizing fake rules, filing false complaints, and dragging me into unnecessary conflict. She had turned a peaceful property owner into a full-time legal strategist. I wasn't going to let that end with a polite handshake. The best revenge came quietly one morning when I received a text from the county clerk. Karen's name had just come across their desk again, but not for a complaint this time. She was filing to sell her house. Apparently, the backlash had gotten so intense, the whispers so loud, that even she realized she'd lost the war. Her pride would never allow her to stay where everyone could see her defeat. A for sale sign went up on her lawn 3 days later. I took a picture of it and added it to the HOA folder I kept under my desk. A private memento for a public mess. To add insult to poetic injury, the day she moved out, Doug offered lakefront discounts to anyone who helped her load her moving truck. Half a dozen teens showed up in Ripwave t-shirts, pretending to drop boxes while posting selfies in front of her sign. One even brought her a goodbye card that read, "Thanks for the drama, enjoy your dry future." I didn't plan any of it, but I can't say I didn't enjoy watching karma in real time. By now, the remaining HOA board members were scrambling. Without Karen's endless noise, they realized they had no idea how to fix what had been broken. I finally received a formal letter, this time humble and polite, requesting a sit-down meeting. They wanted to renegotiate lake access, this time fairly, this time with respect. I told them I'd think about it. But first, I had a condition. Every fake fine issued to me needed to be withdrawn and documented as a board error. Every complaint submitted in my name had to be reviewed and deleted. And most importantly, they had to issue a formal letter to the entire neighborhood acknowledging their actions were legally unfounded and unjust. The new president, Carl, agreed. He said he'd do it. Not because he liked me, but because the entire community needed healing. I told him that was a good start. A week later, a printed letter was mailed to every resident. It included an apology, a full explanation of the boundary error, and a reaffirmation that my property was private and protected. The best part? A new rule was added to their charter stating that no HOA enforcement shall be attempted on land outside the registered HOA parcel map. That clause, I knew, would protect any future homeowners who didn't want Karen 2.0 knocking on their doors with a clipboard and an attitude. As for me, I chose to leave the gate up. I didn't reopen the access. Not right away. I told Carl it would remain locked for the foreseeable future. Not out of spite, but to remind people that access is a privilege, not a right. And that no matter how many forms someone waves in the air, they can't bully their way through someone else's boundary. What began as a silly argument over a boat ramp had evolved into a masterclass in property law, personal boundaries, and the spectacular downfall of entitlement. Karen had tried to control what wasn't hers. She ended up exiling herself from the very community she claimed to protect. And as I sat on my porch with the lake calm and quiet in front of me, I realized something else. You don't need to yell to win. Sometimes, the best way to fight back is with silence, a stack of legal documents, and the kind of stubborn patience only a man with a ramp and a grudge can carry. It started as a quiet Sunday, just the way I liked it. The sun hung low over the water, casting golden light across the ripples, and the last of Karen's moving vans had finally disappeared from the neighborhood. I sat on my porch with a fishing rod beside me and a fresh cup of coffee in hand, watching a few ducks drift lazily by the ramp. The air felt different, lighter, like something heavy had been lifted off the land itself. It wasn't just Karen's absence. It was the knowledge that for the first time in a long while, peace was no longer just a wish. It was a reality carved into the concrete of my ramp and welded into the iron of my gate. But peace doesn't last forever. About mid-morning, I heard tires on gravel. A white SUV pulled up, not one I recognized, and out stepped a man in a blue blazer carrying a leather folder. He introduced himself as Marcus Doyle, a freelance journalist who had been covering bizarre HOA stories across the country. Apparently, someone had tipped him off to what happened here. He wouldn't say who, but I had a feeling Doug and his social media antics had something to do with it. He asked if I was willing to talk. At first, I declined. I had no interest in turning my property war into some internet circus. But then he said something that stopped me cold. He said, "You stood up to something most people just suffer through silently. That's worth hearing." So I agreed. We sat at the edge of the dock, my boots in the water and his recorder tucked between us. I walked him through the whole saga. From the day I fixed the ramp to the morning Karen went cart first into the lake. From the fake complaints to the legal filings. From the graffiti to the jet ski kiosk. He laughed at all the right moments, shook his head in disbelief, and asked sharp questions when the story veered into the legal stuff. When I finished, he closed his folder and said, "You didn't just block access, you rewrote the rules." I didn't think of it that way before, but he wasn't wrong. A few days after his article went live, things changed again. The piece gained traction online, especially on forums and communities where HOA horror stories were common. My story was being shared alongside tales of people fined for having the wrong shade of mulch or being told to remove bird feeders. But what made my story stand out was the ending. The fact that I had won. Not just through revenge or pettiness, but with patience, law, and an iron gate. Comments flooded in from people saying they felt empowered, inspired, and for the first time, like someone had taken a stand and come out on top. I wasn't used to being called a hero, but apparently in the eyes of HOA prisoners across the internet, that's what I had become. Meanwhile, back in the real world, the neighborhood started to settle. With Karen gone and the board reorganized under Carl, things calmed considerably. No more fake notices, no more power plays. Carl came by one afternoon with 2 other board members and asked if I would consider reopening limited access to the lake. Not for the HOA, but for the sake of families who had no other easy way to enjoy the water. They came with no demands, just a respectful tone and a genuine offer. I looked at them and thought about it. It would have been easy to say no, to keep the gate locked and let the HOA live with the consequences of Karen's reign. But I also saw the kids in the background riding bikes, the neighbors waving from porches. The same people who had suffered under her too. They weren't the enemy. Just people trying to live a little easier. So I made a deal. I would reopen the path as a public easement, not under HOA control, but under mine. I drafted the documents myself. The access would remain, but only for families walking to the lake on foot. No HOA signage, no meetings, no claims of control. Just a narrow trail through a land that remembered who had always respected it. They agreed. And the very next weekend, the gate stood open, the sign updated with a single line at the bottom. Lake access by owner permission only. It was quiet, dignified, and mine. Ripwave stayed, of course. Doug had become a bit of a local celebrity thanks to his part in the fiasco, and his business was booming. He added a snack stand, and the sound of kids laughing on jet skis replaced the angry lectures that used to echo down the shoreline. He even named one of his rental boats the Karen Cruiser. I didn't tell him to take it down. If anything, it served as a reminder of what we all endured and overcame. As for Karen, rumor had it she moved 3 towns over and joined another HOA as a resident instead of a board member. Whether she learned anything from what happened, I don't know. But the people here sure did. The community began holding monthly meetings. Not HOA meetings, but open forums where residents could voice concerns without bureaucracy. I attended one and spoke briefly about respecting boundaries. Literal and figurative. They applauded. It was strange being clapped for something that had started as an act of self-defense. Weeks passed. Then months. One evening, I stood at the ramp with the sky glowing orange behind the trees. A boy and his father walked past, nodded respectfully, and asked if they could cast a line off the dock. I told them to enjoy it. As they fished in silence, I thought back to the first day this all began. I remembered Karen's voice echoing across the water, her clipboard swinging in righteous fury, the absurdity of watching her golf cart float like a green canoe. And I smiled, not because of the chaos but because it was over. Not through violence or shouting, but through patience, clarity, and the refusal to be bullied off land I legally owned and deeply respected. In the end, the ramp remained. So did the gate. But more than that, the message endured. That people like Karen don't get to rewrite the world to suit their whims. That laws mean something, that ownership matters, and that if you're willing to stand your ground, with facts, not fury, you can beat even the loudest voices. Not by being louder, but by being right. I turned from the lake, walking back up to the house with my boots crunching on the gravel. The sun dipped low behind me. Another peaceful day. Another quiet victory. And in that moment, I didn't feel like someone who won a war. I just felt like a man with a ramp, a little stubbornness, and the kind of peace you only earn when you fight for it the right way.